Nobody suspected the quiet woman in seat 14C was anything special. Flight attendants ignored her. Passengers dismissed her as ordinary. But when the captain's heart stopped beating and the co-pilot's desperate voice begged for help over the intercom, she would stand up and shock everyone by walking straight into the cockpit. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Nobody noticed her when she boarded flight 447 that Tuesday morning, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Sarah Chen settled into seat 14C wearing faded jeans, a gray hoodie, and worn sneakers, looking like any other tired traveler making the cross-country journey from Boston to San Francisco. She carried a paperback novel, a bottle of water, and the kind of resigned expression that frequent flyers wear when facing a 5-hour flight in economy class. The flight attendant who checked her boarding pass offered the same practiced smile she gave everyone else, never imagining that the woman in the unremarkable clothes had once commanded a Boeing 777 across the Pacific Ocean or that she possessed more flying hours than half the crew combined. Sarah watched the other passengers file past her row, each one focused on finding overhead bin space or settling children into seats. A businessman in an expensive suit took the window seat beside her, immediately opening his laptop without acknowledgement. The young mother across the aisle struggled with a restless toddler while her husband searched frantically for the pacifier that had fallen somewhere near Sarah's feet. When Sarah retrieved it and handed it over with a kind smile, the grateful parents thanked her warmly, assuming she was perhaps a teacher or office worker, someone unremarkable traveling for unremarkable reasons. Nobody could have guessed that this quiet woman had flown combat missions over hostile territory or that she had tested experimental aircraft at speeds that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. The pre-flight safety demonstration began, and Sarah listened with the casual inattention of someone who had heard these instructions 1,000 times before. Except she had delivered these exact words herself from the cockpit, her voice calm and authoritative over the intercom system, reassuring passengers that their safety was her primary concern. She had spent 15 years as a commercial airline captain before transitioning to military aviation, where she flew fighter jets and transport aircraft in some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. After her military service, she became a test pilot for a major aircraft manufacturer, evaluating new designs and pushing experimental planes to their operational limits. 3 months ago, she had transitioned again, this time to a prestigious position training the next generation of airline pilots at a major aviation academy. But today she was just another passenger, traveling to San Francisco for a conference, deliberately keeping her professional identity private because she valued these rare moments of anonymity when nobody expected anything from her except to stay seated with her belt fastened. The engines roared to life with that familiar vibration Sarah felt in her bones. She closed her eyes as the aircraft taxied toward the runway, feeling the subtle shifts in weight distribution and hearing the changes in engine pitch that told her everything about the plane's condition and the pilot's technique. The takeoff was textbook perfect, the nose lifting at exactly the right moment, the climb rate smooth and controlled. Sarah found herself evaluating the cockpit crew's performance out of habit, noting their professional competence with silent approval. Captain Michael Torres and First Officer David Park were handling this Boeing 737 with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from flying together regularly, their coordination evident even to someone sitting 100 feet behind them in the passenger cabin. 2 hours into the flight, the seatbelt sign remained off and the cabin had settled into that familiar rhythm of long-distance travel. The businessman beside Sarah typed relentlessly on his laptop, working on spreadsheets that seemed urgently important to him. The family across the aisle had finally gotten their toddler to sleep, and parents and child dozed peacefully together. Flight attendants moved through the cabin collecting trash and offering beverages with mechanical politeness, their smiles genuine but their attention already moving to the next row before finishing with the current one. When the lead flight attendant, a veteran named Patricia Gonzalez with 20 years of experience, reached Sarah's row, she offered coffee with the same neutral pleasantness she showed everyone, never suspecting that this passenger in the hoodie understood cockpit operations better than most commercial pilots she had ever flown with. Sarah was reading her novel, genuinely absorbed in the mystery plot, when she felt the subtle change in engine sound that made her glance up instinctively. The shift was barely perceptible, nothing that would alarm ordinary passengers, but her trained ears detected the slight reduction in thrust. She told herself it was probably just the crew making minor adjustments for air traffic control requirements or optimizing fuel consumption for the long flight ahead. But something made her close the book and pay closer attention to the ambient sounds around her. That instinct developed over thousands of hours in cockpits, warning her that something might be developing even though everything appeared completely normal to everyone else aboard. 3 minutes later, the intercom crackled to life with a sound Sarah recognized immediately as an open microphone in the cockpit. Instead of the calm, professional announcement passengers expected, there was a confusion of voices, urgent and strained. First Officer Park's voice came through the speakers, tight with stress and lacking the usual measured tone of routine communications. His words were clipped and directed not at passengers but at someone else in the cockpit. Sarah heard him say something about medical emergency and help needed immediately, his voice rising at the end in a way that sent alarm bells ringing through her nervous system. The intercom cut off abruptly, leaving the cabin in stunned silence as hundreds of passengers processed what they had just heard. The atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Parents pulled sleeping children closer. The businessman beside Sarah finally looked up from his laptop, his expression confused and frightened. Sarah remained completely still, her mind already running through emergency protocols while her body stayed relaxed to avoid alarming those around her. She watched the forward cabin area where Patricia and another flight attendant named James Morrison had disappeared behind the cockpit door moments earlier. Through the narrow gap before the door closed completely, Sarah caught a glimpse of Captain Torres slumped forward over the controls, his body at an angle that suggested complete incapacitation. Her heart rate elevated slightly, but her breathing remained controlled as years of emergency training activated automatically. Patricia's voice came over the intercom moments later, and Sarah could hear the barely controlled panic beneath the professional words. The flight attendant announced that they were experiencing a medical emergency and asked if there were any doctors, nurses, or medical professionals aboard the aircraft. Several passengers raised their hands immediately, and Sarah watched as a woman who identified herself as an emergency room physician and a man claiming paramedic experience hurried toward the front of the plane. The cabin buzzed with nervous conversation, passengers speculating about what was happening while trying to comfort each other with hopeful words that everything would surely be fine because these situations always worked out in the end even though nobody really knew if that was true. Sarah remained seated, watching and listening, her mind already 3 steps ahead of everyone else. If the captain was incapacitated and the first officer had called for medical help instead of immediately taking command, it suggested a situation serious enough that he was torn between flying the aircraft and helping his colleague. A heart attack was the most likely scenario given the suddenness and the captain's age bracket. Sarah had witnessed similar emergencies during her career, and she knew that David Park was probably experiencing the worst nightmare any first officer could face, suddenly responsible for 215 souls while his captain lay dying beside him. The intercom crackled again, and this time it was First Officer Park speaking directly to the passengers. His voice was steadier now but carried an edge of desperation that made Sarah's pulse quicken. He announced that Captain Torres had suffered what appeared to be a serious cardiac event and was unconscious. The medical personnel aboard were providing emergency care. But then came the words that Sarah had been expecting and dreading simultaneously. Park asked if there were any pilots aboard the aircraft, any private pilots or anyone with flying experience who could provide assistance in the cockpit. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, revealing the overwhelming pressure he was under trying to manage both the emergency and the complex task of flying a commercial airliner alone. Sarah was out of her seatbelt before Park finished speaking. She moved into the aisle with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to responding to emergencies without hesitation or doubt. The businessman who had been sitting beside her for 2 hours stared at her in complete confusion as she pulled a worn leather wallet from her pocket and extracted a card he could not identify. Other passengers watched her progress up the aisle with curious expressions, wondering if this woman in casual clothes could possibly be a pilot or if she was simply confused about the announcement. A teenage boy near the front actually laughed nervously and whispered to his father that the lady in the hoodie must be crazy if she thought she could fly a plane, his voice loud enough that Sarah heard every word but chose to ignore. Patricia was standing near the cockpit door speaking rapidly into an interphone when Sarah reached her. The flight attendant's face was flushed and her hands trembled slightly as she tried to coordinate between the cockpit and the medical personnel now crowded in the forward galley area around Captain Torres. When Sarah approached and quietly stated that she was a pilot, Patricia's expression cycled through disbelief, desperate hope, and profound relief in rapid succession. Sarah presented her credentials, watching the flight attendant's eyes widen as she read the identification card that listed Sarah's ratings and qualifications in technical language Patricia did not fully understand but recognized as legitimate. Inside the cockpit, Sarah found First Officer David Park struggling to maintain control while simultaneously trying to monitor the medical situation developing behind him. His hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced precision, but his attention was divided in ways that made effective flying nearly impossible. Captain Torres lay on the floor between the forward galley and the cockpit entrance, his face gray and his breathing shallow and irregular. The emergency room Dr. Sarah had seen earlier was performing chest compressions with grim determination while the paramedic managed an oxygen mask they had retrieved from the aircraft's medical kit. The scene was controlled chaos, professional people doing their best in circumstances that were far from ideal. Sarah caught Park's eye and introduced herself with calm authority, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. She explained her background in brief, professional terms that communicated her qualifications without wasting precious seconds on unnecessary details. Park's face transformed as he realized that legitimate help had arrived, someone who actually understood what he was facing and possessed the skills to share the impossible burden he was carrying alone. He gestured urgently toward the captain's seat, which was still pushed back from when Patricia and James had pulled Torres from it minutes earlier. Sarah slid into the left seat with movements that were automatic after thousands of hours in similar cockpits, her hands finding the controls as naturally as breathing. The instrument panel before her displayed a situation that was stable but concerning. They were cruising at 37,000 feet somewhere over the plains of Kansas, the autopilot engaged and holding course towards San Francisco. Fuel levels were adequate for reaching their destination with normal reserves. Weather ahead showed some turbulence developing near the Rockies but nothing catastrophic. On the surface, everything appeared manageable. But Sarah's experienced eye immediately identified the problems that would emerge if they could not stabilize the medical emergency or if complications developed during the approach and landing phase. Park was capable but exhausted from the adrenaline surge and emotional trauma of watching his captain collapse. He needed someone to share the workload, make decisions, and handle the secondary tasks that were overwhelming him. Sarah's first action was to contact air traffic control and inform them of the situation using the precise terminology that identified her as a professional rather than a panicked passenger playing hero. The controller's voice reflected surprise when a different voice came on the frequency, but Sarah's calm explanation and proper radio procedures quickly established her credibility. She identified herself using her full credentials, explained that she was a qualified airline transport pilot and certified flight instructor assuming command of the aircraft while the captain received medical attention, and requested priority handling for potential emergency landing options if the situation deteriorated. The controller acknowledged immediately, his voice shifting to the heightened alertness that meant emergency protocols were now in effect for Flight 447. Patricia's voice came over the intercom moments later, and Sarah could hear the barely controlled panic beneath the professional words. The flight attendant announced that they were experiencing a medical emergency and asked if there were any doctors, nurses, or medical professionals aboard the aircraft. Several passengers raised their hands immediately, and Sarah watched as a woman who identified herself as an emergency room physician and a man claiming paramedic experience hurried toward the front of the plane. The cabin buzzed with nervous conversation, passengers speculating about what was happening while trying to comfort each other with hopeful words that everything would surely be fine because these situations always worked out in the end even though nobody really knew if that was true. Sarah remained seated, watching and listening, her mind already 3 steps ahead of everyone else. If the captain was incapacitated and the first officer had called for medical help instead of immediately taking command, it suggested a situation serious enough that he was torn between flying the aircraft and helping his colleague. A heart attack was the most likely scenario given the suddenness and the captain's age bracket. Sarah had witnessed similar emergencies during her career, and she knew that David Park was probably experiencing the worst nightmare any first officer could face, suddenly responsible for 215 souls while his captain lay dying beside him. The intercom crackled again, and this time it was First Officer Park speaking directly to the passengers. His voice was steadier now but carried an edge of desperation that made Sarah's pulse quicken. He announced that Captain Torres had suffered what appeared to be a serious cardiac event and was unconscious. The medical personnel aboard were providing emergency care. But then came the words that Sarah had been expecting and dreading simultaneously. Park asked if there were any pilots aboard the aircraft, any private pilots or anyone with flying experience who could provide assistance in the cockpit. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, revealing the overwhelming pressure he was under trying to manage both the emergency and the complex task of flying a commercial airliner alone. Sarah was out of her seatbelt before Park finished speaking. She moved into the aisle with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to responding to emergencies without hesitation or doubt. The businessman who had been sitting beside her for 2 hours stared at her in complete confusion as she pulled a worn leather wallet from her pocket and extracted a card he could not identify. Other passengers watched her progress up the aisle with curious expressions, wondering if this woman in casual clothes could possibly be a pilot or if she was simply confused about the announcement. A teenage boy near the front actually laughed nervously and whispered to his father that the lady in the hoodie must be crazy if she thought she could fly a plane, his voice loud enough that Sarah heard every word but chose to ignore. Patricia was standing near the cockpit door speaking rapidly into an interphone when Sarah reached her. The flight attendant's face was flushed and her hands trembled slightly as she tried to coordinate between the cockpit and the medical personnel now crowded in the forward galley area around Captain Torres. When Sarah approached and quietly stated that she was a pilot, Patricia's expression cycled through disbelief, desperate hope, and profound relief in rapid succession. Sarah presented her credentials, watching the flight attendant's eyes widen as she read the identification card that listed Sarah's ratings and qualifications in technical language Patricia did not fully understand but recognized as legitimate. Inside the cockpit, Sarah found First Officer David Park struggling to maintain control while simultaneously trying to monitor the medical situation developing behind him. His hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced precision, but his attention was divided in ways that made effective flying nearly impossible. Captain Torres lay on the floor between the forward galley and the cockpit entrance, his face gray and his breathing shallow and irregular. The emergency room Dr. Sarah had seen earlier was performing chest compressions with grim determination while the paramedic managed an oxygen mask they had retrieved from the aircraft's medical kit. The scene was controlled chaos, professional people doing their best in circumstances that were far from ideal. Sarah caught Park's eye and introduced herself with calm authority, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. She explained her background in brief, professional terms that communicated her qualifications without wasting precious seconds on unnecessary details. Park's face transformed as he realized that legitimate help had arrived, someone who actually understood what he was facing and possessed the skills to share the impossible burden he was carrying alone. He gestured urgently toward the captain's seat, which was still pushed back from when Patricia and James had pulled Torres from it minutes earlier. Sarah slid into the left seat with movements that were automatic after thousands of hours in similar cockpits, her hands finding the controls as naturally as breathing. The instrument panel before her displayed a situation that was stable but concerning. They were cruising at 37,000 feet somewhere over the plains of Kansas, the autopilot engaged and holding course towards San Francisco. Fuel levels were adequate for reaching their destination with normal reserves. Weather ahead showed some turbulence developing near the Rockies but nothing catastrophic. On the surface, everything appeared manageable. But Sarah's experienced eye immediately identified the problems that would emerge if they could not stabilize the medical emergency or if complications developed during the approach and landing phase. Park was capable but exhausted from the adrenaline surge and emotional trauma of watching his captain collapse. He needed someone to share the workload, make decisions, and handle the secondary tasks that were overwhelming him. Sarah's first action was to contact air traffic control and inform them of the situation using the precise terminology that identified her as a professional rather than a panicked passenger playing hero. The controller's voice reflected surprise when a different voice came on the frequency, but Sarah's calm explanation and proper radio procedures quickly established her credibility. She identified herself using her full credentials, explained that she was a qualified airline transport pilot and certified flight instructor assuming command of the aircraft while the captain received medical attention, and requested priority handling for potential emergency landing options if the situation deteriorated. The controller acknowledged immediately, his voice shifting to the heightened alertness that meant emergency protocols were now in effect for Flight 447. Behind her in the cramped space between the cockpit and the galley, the medical team continued their desperate efforts to save Captain Torres. Sarah could hear the rhythmic counting of chest compressions and the urgent, quiet conversations about medications and procedures that meant Torres's condition remained critical. She compartmentalized that information, acknowledging it without allowing it to distract her from the immediate task of ensuring the aircraft remained safe and stable. Park looked at her with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with residual shock, and Sarah gave him a quick nod that communicated everything he needed to know about her capability and her intention to see this situation through to a safe conclusion. The next 20 minutes tested every skill Sarah had developed over her long career. Together with Park, she coordinated with air traffic control to develop multiple contingency plans depending on how Torres's condition evolved. They identified 3 potential diversion airports along their route where advanced medical facilities could receive a cardiac patient immediately. Sarah ran calculations for fuel consumption, landing performance, and approach procedures at each location while simultaneously monitoring the aircraft systems and maintaining awareness of the developing situation behind her. Park handled communications with the airline's operations center, speaking to dispatchers and senior pilots who could provide guidance and support from the ground. The cockpit became an efficient, professional workspace as 2 skilled pilots executed their training with precision that would have been impossible if Sarah had not appeared when she did. The emergency room doctor, whose name was Lisa Brennan, appeared in the cockpit doorway with an expression that communicated terrible news before she spoke a word. Torres had been unresponsive to all resuscitation efforts. They had administered medications from the aircraft's emergency kit and used the automated external defibrillator that every commercial aircraft carried, but Torres's heart had sustained massive damage that was beyond what could be treated with available resources. Dr. Brennan's voice was professional but heavy with exhaustion and regret as she explained that they had done everything possible but Captain Torres was gone. The paramedic behind her nodded confirmation, his face reflecting the defeat that came from losing a battle against death despite best efforts. Park's face crumpled for just a moment before he regained control, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he processed the loss of his colleague and friend. Sarah reached across the center console and briefly touched his shoulder, a gesture of comfort and solidarity that acknowledged the tragedy while simultaneously communicating that they still had a job to finish and 214 people depending on them to remain focused and professional. She made the decision that they would continue to San Francisco rather than divert, knowing that Torres was beyond help and that getting everyone else on the ground safely was now the priority. Park agreed quietly, his voice rough with emotion but his hands steady on the controls. Sarah took command formally, announcing to the cabin through the intercom that she was a qualified airline pilot who would be flying the aircraft to their destination in San Francisco. She explained that Captain Torres had unfortunately passed away despite all medical efforts, her voice gentle but clear as she delivered news that would devastate Torres's family and friends but needed to be communicated honestly. She assured the passengers that she and First Officer Park were fully qualified and prepared to complete the flight safely, using the tone of absolute confidence that passengers needed to hear in order to trust that they were in capable hands. The cabin fell into stunned silence as people absorbed the reality that they would be landing with a dead pilot aboard and a stranger in casual clothes flying the plane instead of the professional crew they had trusted when they boarded. The approach to San Francisco International Airport occurred in weather that had deteriorated significantly since they began their descent. Strong crosswinds buffeted the aircraft as Sarah guided it through increasingly turbulent air, her hands making constant small adjustments to maintain the precise flight path required for the instrument approach they were executing. Park called out altitudes and airspeeds in the rhythmic pattern that cockpit crews use to maintain situational awareness, his voice now steady and professional as he channeled his grief into the technical excellence that would honor his captain's memory. Air traffic control had cleared all other aircraft from their path, giving Flight 447 priority handling and positioning emergency vehicles along the runway in preparation for the landing. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with the unconscious grace that came from thousands of repetitions of these exact movements. She extended flaps and landing gear at precisely the right moments, adjusted throttle settings to compensate for wind shear that tried to push them off course, and maintained the perfect balance between pitch and power that would bring them to the runway at exactly the right speed and angle. The Boeing 737 responded to her inputs like an extension of her body, the aircraft and pilot working together in the harmony that defined excellent flying. Park monitored systems and called out parameters, his training evident in every word and action as he proved himself to be an exceptional first officer whose captain would have been proud of his performance under impossible circumstances. The wheels touched down on San Francisco's runway with a smoothness that drew spontaneous applause from the passengers who had been holding their breath during the final descent. Sarah deployed thrust reversers and applied brakes with precise control, bringing the aircraft to a stop on the taxiway where emergency vehicles already waited with lights flashing in the afternoon sunlight. Fire trucks and ambulances surrounded them immediately, but Sarah completed her shutdown checklist with deliberate care, ensuring that every system was properly secured before she would release the aircraft to the emergency responders waiting outside. Park worked beside her in silence, both pilots focusing on their professional responsibilities while privately processing the emotional trauma of everything that had happened in the last 2 hours. Patricia opened the cockpit door once they were parked, her face streaked with tears but her voice steady as she thanked Sarah with words that could not adequately express the gratitude she felt toward this stranger who had saved everyone aboard. The other flight attendants crowded behind her, their professional composure cracking as the adrenaline wore off and the reality of what might have happened crashed over them in waves of delayed shock. Sarah accepted their thanks with quiet humility, insisting that she had simply done what any qualified pilot would have done in the same circumstances, though everyone present knew that most people would have frozen or made critical errors under such pressure. The passengers deplaned slowly, many stopping to shake Sarah's hand or embrace her tearfully as they passed the cockpit where she still sat in the captain's seat. The businessman who had sat beside her for 2 hours appeared in the doorway looking sheepish and amazed, apologizing for not recognizing that someone extraordinary had been sitting next to him the whole time. The parents with the toddler stopped to let their child give Sarah a sleepy high five, the little girl oblivious to the drama but sensing that this woman was someone special. The teenage boy who had laughed at her earlier stood silently with his father, both of them looking at Sarah with expressions of awe and respect that made her uncomfortable because she genuinely did not see herself as a hero but simply as someone who had done her job when circumstances required it. Federal Aviation Administration investigators arrived within an hour, along with representatives from the airline and the National Transportation Safety Board who would conduct the formal investigation into Captain Torres's death. Sarah spent the next 3 hours in detailed debriefings, walking them through every decision and action from the moment she entered the cockpit until the wheels touched down in San Francisco. The investigators treated her with professional courtesy mixed with barely concealed amazement at her credentials and her composure throughout the emergency. Her detailed recall of events, precise descriptions of aircraft parameters, and clear explanations of her decision-making process demonstrated the kind of professional excellence that defined elite aviators. They told her that her actions had undoubtedly prevented a catastrophe that would have resulted in hundreds of deaths and that formal commendations would likely follow from multiple aviation authorities. David Park found her in the airport terminal hours later, after the investigators had finally released them both. He still looked shaken and exhausted, his captain's hat clutched in his hands as he approached Sarah with eyes that had seen too much death for one day. They sat together in a quiet corner of the terminal, two pilots who had shared an experience that would bind them together forever despite having been strangers a few hours earlier. Park talked about Torres, remembering his mentor's kindness and his passion for flying, his voice breaking occasionally as grief overwhelmed his attempt at composure. Sarah listened quietly, offering the silent support that came from understanding what Park was feeling because she had lost colleagues herself over the years and knew that the pain would fade but never completely disappear. The media coverage began almost immediately, news outlets across the country picking up the story of the mysterious passenger who saved hundreds of lives when tragedy struck at 37,000 feet. Reporters tracked down Sarah's background and published articles highlighting her extraordinary career, from her early days as a commercial airline captain through her military service flying combat missions to her recent work as a test pilot and instructor. Passengers from Flight 447 gave interviews describing the quiet woman in the hoodie who had seemed so ordinary but proved to be anything but when crisis emerged. The airline released statements praising her actions and announcing that they were awarding her lifetime travel privileges and a substantial financial reward that Sarah immediately redirected to a fund for Torres's family. Standing in the San Francisco airport terminal as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Sarah Chen watched aircraft take off and land through the massive windows that overlooked the runways. She was still wearing her jeans and hoodie, still carrying her paperback novel and looking like any other ordinary traveler, but now airport staff and passengers recognized her face from news reports and social media posts that had already gone viral. People approached respectfully to thank her or ask for photographs, and she obliged patiently while privately wishing she could return to the comfortable anonymity she had enjoyed just hours earlier. Her phone vibrated with messages from former colleagues, students, and friends who had seen the news and wanted to express their congratulations and their lack of surprise that Sarah Chen had once again proven herself to be one of the finest pilots of her generation. The academy where she taught had already called to inform her that applications had increased dramatically as aspiring pilots expressed their desire to be trained by the woman who exemplified grace under pressure and professional excellence. Sarah smiled at the irony that her attempt to travel anonymously had resulted in precisely the kind of public attention she had been trying to avoid. But as she prepared to board another flight that would take her home to Boston, Sarah reflected on the day's events with the perspective that came from decades of aviation experience. She thought about Captain Torres and the family who would grieve his loss, about David Park who would carry both trauma and pride from his performance under impossible circumstances, about the passengers who would tell their grandchildren about the day an ordinary-looking woman saved their lives, and about her own role in events that reminded her why she had devoted her life to aviation in the first place. Flying was about more than mechanical skill or technical knowledge. It was about the sacred responsibility of carrying human lives through dangerous skies and returning them safely to the ground, about maintaining composure when chaos threatened to overwhelm, about making correct decisions when wrong choices meant death. She settled into her seat on the evening flight to Boston, accepting the captain's personal invitation to visit the cockpit before departure with genuine pleasure. The crew treated her with the respect that one professional extends to another, and Sarah found herself sharing stories about the day's events while carefully avoiding anything that might identify specific individuals or violate the privacy of those involved. The captain, a veteran with 30 years of experience, shook his head in admiration and admitted that he hoped he would perform as well if ever faced with similar circumstances, though he fervently hoped that day would never come. As the aircraft lifted off into the darkening sky, Sarah gazed out the window at the lights of San Francisco falling away below. She thought about all the ordinary-looking passengers traveling on thousands of flights at this exact moment, each one carrying their own hidden depths and secret capabilities that might never be revealed unless circumstances demanded it. She wondered how many other seemingly unremarkable people were sitting in economy seats right now, possessing extraordinary skills that their fellow passengers would never suspect or discover. The world was full of hidden heroes, she reflected, people who walked through life unnoticed and unrecognized until the moment when fate called upon them to reveal what they were truly capable of achieving. Sarah Chen closed her eyes as the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, feeling the familiar vibration of the engines and the subtle movements that told her experienced senses everything about the aircraft's condition and the crew's competence. Tomorrow she would return to the academy and her students, carrying with her a renewed appreciation for the profession she had dedicated her life to mastering. She would use this experience to teach them about more than emergency procedures and technical skills. She would teach them about character and responsibility, about remaining calm when others panic, about the profound privilege and burden of holding lives in your hands at 37,000 feet where mistakes are unforgiving and excellence is the only acceptable standard. The flight attendant passed through the cabin offering beverages, and Sarah accepted a coffee with a grateful smile, just another ordinary passenger traveling through the night sky toward home and rest after an extraordinary day. She pulled out her paperback novel, finding her place and resuming the mystery story that had been interrupted by real-life drama more intense than any fiction. But she found her mind wandering from the printed page to the events of the day, to the memory of Captain Torres's sacrifice and First Officer Park's courage, to the profound satisfaction of using her skills to save lives and prevent tragedy. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the auditorium of the National Aviation Academy where she taught, facing a classroom filled with aspiring pilots who looked at her with expressions that mixed admiration with intimidation. The story of Flight 447 had become legendary in aviation circles, studied and analyzed in training programs across the country as an example of both the unpredictability of flight operations and the importance of maintaining proficiency in emergency procedures. Sarah had been invited to speak at conferences and seminars, offered positions with major airlines and aircraft manufacturers, and contacted by documentary producers who wanted to tell her story to international audiences. But she had declined most of these opportunities, choosing instead to remain at the academy where she believed her experience could have the greatest impact on the future of aviation safety. Standing before her students, many of whom had enrolled specifically to learn from her, Sarah began her lecture not with dramatic tales of heroism but with fundamental principles of airmanship and decision-making under pressure. She explained that the successful outcome of Flight 447 resulted not from any single moment of brilliance but from decades of consistent practice, continuous learning, and unwavering commitment to professional standards that define truly exceptional pilots. Her students listened with rapt attention as Sarah walked them through the technical aspects of the emergency, using the actual data and flight parameters to illustrate decision points and alternative courses of action. She emphasized that David Park deserved equal recognition for his performance under circumstances that would have overwhelmed lesser pilots, and that the entire crew from flight attendants to medical professionals aboard had contributed to the positive outcome through their coordinated response. Sarah stressed that aviation safety depended on teams rather than individuals, on systems and procedures rather than heroic interventions, and that the best pilots were those who hoped never to face emergencies but remained perpetually prepared for them. During the question session that followed, a young woman in the front row raised her hand hesitantly and asked the question that Sarah had been expecting. The student wanted to know if Sarah had been afraid during the emergency, if doubt had crept into her mind during the approach to San Francisco, if she had questioned her ability to save everyone aboard. Sarah paused before answering, considering how to communicate complex truth to students who needed to understand both the reality of fear and the necessity of functioning despite it. She explained that fear was a natural and appropriate response to dangerous situations, that her heart had raced and her palms had sweated just like anyone else facing life-or-death circumstances. But she had learned through training and experience to acknowledge fear without allowing it to control her actions or cloud her judgment. The key was not eliminating fear but channeling it into heightened focus and careful attention to procedures that had been developed and refined over decades of aviation experience. Sarah told her students that confidence came not from believing you were invincible but from trusting your training and accepting that you had prepared as thoroughly as possible for whatever challenges might arise. Another student asked about the moment when Sarah had decided to reveal her identity and approach the cockpit, wondering if she had hesitated or considered remaining anonymous to avoid responsibility. Sarah smiled at the question because it revealed the student's honest grappling with the weight of capability and the burden of expertise. She explained that once she heard First Officer Park's call for pilot assistance, there had been no real decision to make because her training and professional ethics left only one possible course of action. To remain seated with her qualifications while others died would have been a betrayal of everything she believed about duty and responsibility. She told them that having extraordinary skills created obligations that ordinary people did not face, that expertise was both privilege and burden because it meant you could not hide behind ignorance or claim inability when circumstances demanded your unique capabilities. Sarah emphasized that this principle extended far beyond aviation, that anyone who developed specialized knowledge or advanced skills in any field acquired responsibility to use those abilities for the benefit of others when the situation required it. The world needed people who would step forward rather than remain invisible, who would accept burden rather than avoid it, who would risk failure rather than guarantee tragedy through inaction. As the lecture concluded and students began filing out of the auditorium, many stopped to speak with Sarah personally, thanking her for her honesty and vulnerability in sharing not just the technical details but the emotional and ethical dimensions of her experience. A young man who introduced himself as Marcus mentioned that he had been reconsidering his decision to pursue aviation as a career because he worried about whether he possessed the courage and capability to handle emergency situations. Sarah's words had helped him understand that courage was not the absence of fear but the commitment to act despite it, and that capability came not from innate talent but from dedicated preparation and continuous improvement. Sarah walked across the academy campus as evening settled over the facility, watching student pilots practice touch-and-go landings on the training runways and listening to the familiar sounds of aircraft engines that had formed the soundtrack of her adult life. She thought about Captain Torres and the family she had met at his memorial service, a wife and 2 teenage daughters who had thanked Sarah through their tears for bringing their husband and father's aircraft home safely even though they could not bring him home. She thought about David Park, who had sent her a message just yesterday mentioning that he was working with a therapist to process the trauma but that he was determined to continue flying because he believed Torres would have wanted him to honor their shared profession by persevering through difficulty. She thought about the passengers from Flight 447, many of whom had written letters expressing gratitude that went far beyond the immediate circumstances of the emergency. They described how the experience had changed their perspective on life, made them more aware of their own mortality and more appreciative of the ordinary moments they had previously taken for granted. Several had mentioned making significant life changes, pursuing deferred dreams or repairing damaged relationships because they recognized that any flight might be their last and they wanted to live with fewer regrets and more authenticity. Sarah realized that the impact of that single afternoon extended in directions she could never fully comprehend, rippling outward through hundreds of lives and touching thousands of people connected to those who had been aboard Flight 447. Every passenger who returned home safely had families and friends whose lives would have been shattered by tragedy but were instead allowed to continue in ordinary happiness because of decisions made and actions taken at 37,000 feet. The businessman in the expensive suit had gone home to his wife and children. The young family had celebrated their toddler's 2nd birthday just days after the emergency. The teenage boy who had laughed at her had written a college application essay about learning not to judge people by appearances and the importance of recognizing hidden excellence in unexpected places. As she reached her office on the academy campus, Sarah found a package waiting on her desk with a return address she did not recognize. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a handwritten note from Patricia Gonzalez, the flight attendant who had been first to see Captain Torres collapse. Patricia explained that she had been keeping a gratitude journal since the emergency, writing daily about the gift of continued life and the reminder that every person she encountered might possess hidden depths and unexpected capabilities. She had included this blank journal for Sarah, hoping that she too might find value in recording thoughts and reflections during this period when her life had been so dramatically disrupted by unwanted attention and recognition. Sarah sat at her desk as darkness filled the windows and campus lights illuminated the runways where tomorrow's pilots practiced skills that might one day save lives just as hers had done. She opened the journal to the first blank page and began to write, not about technical procedures or emergency protocols but about the strange alchemy that transforms ordinary moments into extraordinary ones, about the responsibility that comes with capability, and about the countless ordinary-looking people moving through the world carrying excellence in silence until the universe calls upon them to reveal what they truly are. She wrote about Captain Torres and the sacred trust that pilots accept when they occupy the left seat, about David Park and the resilience required to continue flying after witnessing tragedy, and about her own journey from anonymity to recognition and her hope that she might eventually return to the comfortable invisibility she had always preferred. And in that moment, sitting alone in her office while aircraft flew overhead carrying passengers who would never know her name or face, Sarah Chin understood that the greatest gift she could offer was not the dramatic rescue that would define her public legacy but the quiet influence she would have on students who would carry forward her values and standards into careers that might span decades and touch millions of lives. She would teach them to be ready always, to maintain skills even when they seemed unnecessary, to step forward when others stepped back, and to accept the burden of expertise with humility and grace. The real heroism was not the visible moment of crisis but the invisible years of preparation that made success possible when that moment finally arrived.